So we've been walking through the book of Joshua, and again, repetition, they say, is the mother of all learning. So I keep saying these things over and over again, just so that we can sort of remind ourselves the principles and some of the key components of what it means to walk in victory. And one of the first things that we learned was that the presence of God is important. It was important in Joshua's life. God's call was on his life, but Joshua had his own encounter with God, and he had experienced the presence of God. We looked at the faith of Rahab and how that faith brought her family to salvation, spared them from death and the spoils of war. And so faith is important if we're going to walk in victory. Obedience matters if we're going to walk in victory, to obey God and his word in our lives. We looked at the importance of spiritual markers and laying sort of those milestones down in our lives so that we can have a point of reference. And we talked a couple weeks ago about how God can turn bad situations and maybe even failures, troubled times, God can turn that around into something that works in our lives for positive and brings victory for us. But that's a powerful work of God in our lives. And we also, I think last week we were talking about walking in what God has for us, in the land that we are to possess specifically. As a believer, God has given to each one of us certain talents and abilities and gifts. And when we walk in what God has provided for us, we find fulfillment. But we also need to be aware that sometimes we don't fully possess what God has given to us. We let the enemy kind of linger in our land. And so encouragement is that we push the enemy back and walk fully in what God has for us as our inheritance and our provision as believers. This morning, I want us to look at the story of Caleb. We've mentioned him in our verses last week. When they started to divide the land amongst the tribes, Caleb went first. He was the one who got his allotment of land first. And we're going to come back to that story in Joshua in just a little bit. But in order to understand Caleb, we need to go back to the book of Numbers. All right? So Joshua is where we are, but let's look at Caleb's background in the book of Numbers, chapter 14. Joshua, again, you've heard this joke, had no parents. He was the son of none. Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord." Remember, this is Joshua and Caleb speaking. Do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. But the whole assembly talked about stoning them, and the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meetings to all the Israelites. So that's a shortened version of the story, how Moses had sent 12 spies into the land, and when they came back, we know there were 10 that said, "Can't be done. They're too big, their cities are too fortified. Yeah, there's good stuff there. It's a land of plenty. There's produce, there's resources, there's food, there's water, there's everything we need, but that we can't possibly overcome these people." That was 10. And I think when we talked about that way back, the 10 spies, we don't know their names. They're given to us in the Bible, but nobody remembers the 10 negatives. But the 2 positives we know, Joshua and Caleb. They said, yes, it's a formidable country. The people are well armed. Their cities are well fortified, but God's with us. So we can do that. That was Caleb and Joshua. And as we look at those verses, we can, as they speak in verse 6 and on, we can almost sense the frustration in Caleb's life and the danger that they were in. In verse 10, the people are going to kill these two. It's not just a theoretical concept that we're dealing with here. Caleb is frustrated with the negative words of the other 10 spies and how quickly they discouraged the whole of God's people. Negative words spread quickly, and they bring discouragement to people. And I think in life, for most of us, it's the other people who cause us the most frustration. It's the other drivers, right? They're the ones who frustrate us when they don't understand the priority of our agenda today and how 60 kilometers on Stony on a snowy day is a little bit overkill for slowing down for the weather. When you want to grab a couple things from the store, it's the store manager who has strategically hidden the one item you're looking for. Baked beans. They're not where they're supposed to be. Until, they're on sale, sir. They're over at the end of aisle 14. We moved them. That's frustration. It's always other people. It's the person in front of you in line at checkout who has 57 items and you're in the express lane. Or there's always one person who has to, what were they doing the other day? Their card doesn't work. Well then let's try this card. And let's try this card. Well, maybe I have enough cash. And you got your three things. And they're frustrating you because I have a goal. I have a place I want to be. I have an agenda to fulfill. And you are slowing me down. This was Caleb. He had an agenda. He had a place he needed to be. He had goals he wanted to fulfill. And now people were slowing him down, not letting him get where he wants to go. Sometimes, the grocery stores and traffic, my pet peeve, if you're going to visit at the grocery store, find a zone, not at the end of the aisle where you bumped into your friend, literally ran, "Oh, hi, how are you?" The aisle is here, there's a cart here, there's a cart here, and that's where I need to go. My goals, my agendas. You're prohibiting me from fulfilling that, so now I'm frustrated with you. But what about the naysayers in our life who say you can't do that? You're not good enough. You're not strong enough. You're not talented enough. You don't have enough money to do that. There's 1,000 ways the people around us can frustrate us when we're trying to achieve our God-given goals and take possession of what God has for us. And so we need to see past all of that frustration by the grace of God and patiently work for the end that God has planned for us, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will bring it to completion. Can you imagine Caleb in the wilderness? How long were they in the wilderness? 40 years. Caleb already saw where he wanted to be. Not just figuratively, not just in his mind's eye. Caleb had walked the land that he wanted to possess, his goals, his agenda. But now for 40 years, he has to walk and travel with the naysayers. The point of the 40 years was that generation had to die off. That was the 40-year journey in the wilderness. Those who rebelled against God were taken away out of the picture, except for Joshua and Caleb, because they wholeheartedly followed the Lord. So for 40 years, he was living with the people who had kept him from achieving his goals, from going where he wanted to be, from going where he knew God wanted him to be. And he couldn't get there, and he had to live life with that generation. Can you imagine the conversations between Joshua and Caleb? I know, man. This sucks. Like we should be with our feet up in our hammock, in our homes, in our land that God has promised us. We're almost 80 years old now. We should be relaxing. But Hang on, brother. There's only a few of them left. There's only a few naysayers. Once this generation is gone, it'll be okay. That was the life Caleb lived. 40 years in the wilderness, knowing the potential in God that he had, yet not being able to live it out, to actually enjoy it. And as we go through our lives, we see that the people around us have a profound effect on us. When a drunk driver takes a life, it's not only his life that's affected, but a multitude of others. Spouses choose to act poorly, sinfully. And that affects not only them, but their partner and sometimes entire families. We're not able to control the thought processes and the decisions that others around us are making. But when their decisions stand between us and our goals, we start to feel that frustration, right? The people, Joshua and Caleb, couldn't change the minds of the other 10 spies and basically the whole nation who choose not to go into the promised land. Remember the story of Achan? When Achan sinned, when he disobeyed, he was stoned. But the Israelites were affected too. They were demoralized. They suffered defeat. People died. And even though Caleb and Joshua could see that God would get them into and through the conquering of the land, they were frustrated in their attempt to reach their goal because of the influence of the people around them. Now, it's getting pretty easy to start to point fingers, isn't it? Because it's not going to be my fault. It's their fault. It's your fault. No. You can point at me and say it's his fault. I can point at you and say it's your fault. But we need to understand that our words, our actions, our beliefs have an effect on those around us. And those around us are having an effect on us. And so we will face frustration in life. It can be internal. Sometimes we frustrate ourselves. I do. I don't know if you've ever frustrated yourself. I want to do this. I have a goal. And the only person standing in my way is, that guy. And he's frustrating. He's a frustrating guy to deal with too. Even Jesus faced it. In Matthew's gospel, we have probably heard these words, story from Jesus' life, Matthew chapter 13, verse 54. And he came to his hometown, and he began teaching the people in the synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get his wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked. Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Jesus came from a big family. Did you know that? I mean, he only had siblings that Joseph and Mary had, but there's sisters and at least 4 brothers in Jesus. So we're talking at least 8 in Jesus' family of kids, right? But what happened? They took offense at him, and Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town and in his own house." And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. I'm sure Jesus had big plans for his hometown. Wouldn't it be wonderful just to go home and knock their socks off? And see the miracles and all the people that you knew and your relatives and the guys that you grew up with and your brothers and sisters and everybody just giving you the accolades. Lord, as we were saying this morning, I exalt thee. Praising Jesus. He's doing all this stuff. And yet he could not because of their lack of belief. His agenda was frustrated by other people. It wasn't Jesus' lack of willingness. It was their lack of belief. It was others who were causing the frustration. So in Caleb's life, it would have been easier if just, you know what? They're at the annual meeting, and there's 10 naysayers, and they're Caleb and Joshua, and they're like, these guys think we can't do it. Shh, quiet. Just don't say anything. Just let them run with it. There's no way we're going to overcome in this situation. But it was more than just personal goals that Caleb wasn't willing to let go. His personal goals had been blocked, and he may have wanted to get to that piece of land, but Caleb understood something in Numbers chapter 14, and we'll go back there again. Caleb's perspective, Numbers 14 and verse 8. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Caleb stood for God's principles in his life. He didn't say, and he might have been thinking, we don't know, but he might have been thinking, I already know where I'm building my house in the promised land. Let's go get it. I have a conviction and I know what I'm going to do. But his primary concern was, don't mess with God. Don't rebel. Don't disobey. God will give us this land. He will lead us through. And it got real in verse 10 when the people were going to kill them. It's not a debate. It wasn't a discussion about God's ability. It came to a life-threatening moment for Joshua and Caleb, and yet they stood their ground. They could have just said, oh, okay, sorry, we didn't mean to ruffle any feathers. We didn't mean to make any waves. We will just go with the flow. They could have. But Caleb was a man of, what we say, intestinal fortitude. He had guts. He was strong. He had inner strength to make that call. And so in the story in Numbers chapter 14, Moses intercedes for the people, asks for corporate forgiveness, and God does grant that. He's in Numbers chapter 14, when the people said, we can't take the land, Moses prays. God says, okay, you're going to get the land, but this generation has to die off first. That's the condition. All of these rebellious people have to die off, except for Joshua and Caleb. So that was great. But they still had to wait 40 years. There was still a 40-year gap between when they should have gone into the land and when they did go into the land. So Joshua and Caleb are given the privilege of getting to that point where they can go to the promised land, but they still had to wait 40 years. How long do people wait in the Bible? David had to wait 30 years, from the time, or 25 years, from the time he was anointed king by Samuel till the time he became king. Jesus was in his 30s when he started his ministry. How many times do we like to rush God's agenda? But Caleb and Joshua had to wait 40 years. Now let's go down to Numbers chapter 14 again, verse 20. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. This is after Moses prayed for the people. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of these who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. It wasn't just about personal goals. It was about their attitude towards God. But because of my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valleys, turn back tomorrow and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea. And so God's understanding of Caleb was he was a man with a different spirit who followed God with his whole heart. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy strength, with all thy soul, with all thy might. That's wholehearted. Not kind of half-hearted following God. Caleb was one who followed God wholeheartedly, and it's repeated a couple times in those verses. Caleb was sold out for the purposes of God in his life. So he had the fortitude and the inner strength that got him through the frustrations in life. And that's the kind of integrity that we need in our lives today. The power to stand for convictions and the Lord when everyone around us is wavering and being naysayers. We're light in the dark world. We carry a treasure in these jars of clay. Caleb wasn't as concerned with his own rights as he was with God's reputation. God can do this. God is able. And so in Numbers chapter 14 and verse 9, we've read it a couple times. Caleb said, don't rebel against the Lord. Don't be afraid of the people of the land, because he will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. The Lord is with us. Do not be afraid. I've mentioned this a couple times. When you see the cry or the call to courage and driving out fear, you will find the promise of the presence of God. Joshua, do not be discouraged, for I am with you. Caleb said, the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid. It's a reverse statement, but it's the same thing. God's presence and lack of fear are linked together. When I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. That's the conqueror of fear, is the presence of God in our lives. So Caleb had faith in God to do this, but our faith is only as good as the object we put it in. Caleb could have trusted in himself and could have said, I think I'm strong enough, I'm powerful enough. I think I can get this done. I don't need anybody's help. I'm just going to trust in me and get it done. Or maybe he would look to Joshua and say, he's a mighty warrior. He's got good strategies. Joshua wins battles. Let's follow him. He can get this done. Caleb said, God can do this. It wasn't him. It wasn't Joshua. It wasn't the people even corporately together. Caleb's faith was in God and his ability. So where's your faith today? Where do you trust for victory in your life? Where do you look? Are you relying on your willpower for victory? Perhaps you're counting resources offered by someone else to get you to that place of fulfillment and possessing what God has for you. Put your faith in God for whatever he's leading you to. That's a place to start. Put your faith in God. And sometimes we just need to go back to the beginning and start praying again. Because as we progress through struggles, sometimes we start to pick up this and that, and I think I got this handled. I'll figure it out. I can do this. And ultimately, we need to get back to that place where we're totally dependent on the Lord. He is our source. So let's turn to Joshua. Took a long time to get to Joshua. So that's the introduction. I heard that, Darlene. My wife laughed at me. Joshua chapter 14, verse 6. The people of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him, you know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But my fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord God, my God, wholeheartedly. So on that day, isn't it great to be able to talk about yourself that way? I followed God wholeheartedly. We're going to get to another verse in a minute. So on that day, Moses swore to me, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive 45 years since that time. He said this to Moses while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. How many here are strong now? Who's 85? Ladies, don't show your age, but who's as strong 45 years today as they were 45 years ago? How strong was I when I was 12? No. He's as strong today as he was 45 years ago. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Verse 12. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised to me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. And Joshua blessed Caleb the son of Jephunneh and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite ever since, because he followed the Lord of Israel wholeheartedly. And the land had rest from war. The promise was fulfilled. Maybe not on Caleb's timetable, the way he would have liked it. 45 years, that's a long time to wait. I mean, there was scoping out the land, then there was the wilderness and everybody had to die off, and then they've been moving into possessing the land. And so now 45 years later, after Caleb faced that frustration, and ultimately he is now about to receive what God has for him. Now, none of us are guaranteed 85 years. That's a pretty good age. And the strength to proceed with what God has promised. But the principle here is Caleb finished well. He could have just passed the torch. He could have dragged himself across the finish line and just kind of collapsed. But even in his mature years, he had the desire and the drive to fulfill in his life what God had promised him. You don't have to wait till you're 85 to do it. Just the other side of that coin. But God can give us the desire and the strength and the drive to fulfill his purpose and plan for our lives. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, in verse 7, Paul said this to his young charge, Timothy. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Paul also was a man with fortitude and faith, and he had finished the race. He'd seen the fulfillment and knew there was a reward waiting for him. So my encouragement simply for us today, after all those words, is understand that life will often bring us frustration. But that doesn't have to be the end. We can press through in God. He is able. That was Caleb's cry. He followed the Lord. And just by implication, this is a different sermon, but he followed the Lord, which meant what? The Lord went before him. Right? God went where Caleb was going to go. He followed the Lord wholeheartedly. And so that means God's ahead. So my problem is I get ahead of God too often. And I say, come along, Lord, let's go have a good time today. Just follow me. Caleb followed the Lord wholeheartedly. And we can all do that. It's a surrender of our wills and our agenda and our understanding of God's timetable sometimes, and allowing him to do. We can be confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in us will bring it to completion. It took 45 years for Caleb to get that completed, but God did it in his life. Amen. Let's stand together.